Hi there, I'm Pastor Katrina Lottie here at Homer City United Methodist Church in Western Pennsylvania. Today I would like to read to you from the book of Genesis, chapter 21, verses 8 through 21. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast day on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to do, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for your son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took the bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of my child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Today's story, in my opinion, is both one of the saddest stories in the Bible when it comes to people, and one of the most beautiful when it comes to God. Most of us are generally familiar with the story of Abraham, but let me give you a little refresher. God called Abraham to be the father of what was to become the nation of Israel, or the Jewish people. Abraham eventually had a son, Isaac, and Isaac had a son, Jacob. For generations after, the Jews, Israel, would claim to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, getting back to Abraham, God told good old Abe that he and his wife Sarah would have as many offspring as the stars. But they were old, well past childbearing years, and it seems they no longer had marital relations. Sarah laughed at the idea. It was, by any human reasoning, a ridiculous idea. Well, God made them wait a bit longer, becoming even older. Sarah's womb became even dustier, and in desperation, Sarah did what we often do when we think God is taking too long. She took things into her own hands. When Abraham was 86 years old, Sarah had Abraham lay with her servant Hagar in order for Abraham to have a child. Eventually, God followed through on his promise, and when Abraham was 100 years old, the elderly Sarah conceived and later gave birth to Isaac, who was the one promised to the aging couple. It was Sarah's idea for Abraham to lay with Hagar, and for her to get pregnant and give birth to a child for Abraham. But as is often the case, when we take things into our own hands, instead of trusting in God and waiting for God's timing, we get what we want, only to soon realize that it wasn't what we wanted at all. Sarah was terribly jealous of Hagar. She felt threatened by her. And so instead of finding a way to work things out, instead of being righteous and working on her own issues, she had Hagar and Ishmael sent away. I cannot imagine what it was like for Hagar or for Ishmael. Hagar was essentially a slave. You can dress it up, call her a second wife to Abraham, or call her a servant, but she was a slave. She was Egyptian, but we don't know where she came from prior to coming to live with Abraham and Sarah. Slaves were sold into slavery in a couple of ways. Often they were taken as prisoners when a nation was overtaken in war. Sometimes families would sell their children into slavery because they couldn't afford to care for them, or they didn't desire to take care of them. And sometimes people sold themselves into slavery in order to pay off a debt because it was the only way they could survive. We don't know Hagar's story. We don't know where she came from, what her family was like, or if she had any family at all. We don't know if she was ever married, how old she was, or what kind of trauma she had faced in her life. What we do know is that Hagar was a slave. She was considered property, not a person of worth. She wasn't allowed to think for herself or do what she wanted or to be her own person. She didn't even have control over her own body. Sarah treated Hagar so terribly that the word used for how Sarah treated Hagar is the same word used to describe the oppression of Israel. It was so bad that Hagar ran away. Now God found Hagar and brought her back, offering this slave woman the same promise he had offered to Sarah, that she would bear a child who would become the father of many nations. So Hagar returned to Sarah and Abraham. And then Hagar was forced to lie with Abraham. There was no consent to be given. She had no choice but to lie with him as he got her pregnant. And every day as that child grew in her womb, I believe that she fell more in love with the child. And perhaps for the first time ever, she felt a connection with someone. Ishmael was her only family, and she loved him. But also, as the child grew in her womb, Hagar was reminded of the way that Sarah had treated her, including essentially having her husband rape her. So of course there was bitterness and a whole lot of mixed emotion with Hagar. And after Sarah had a child of her own and no longer needed Ishmael, the dust hit the fan. Abraham did not stand up to his wife Sarah for her treatment of Hagar. Instead, Ishmael's father Abraham let his son go off to likely die in the desert, along with the son's mother. There was no way to know what would happen to them. Hagar was, of course, completely expendable. She was just a slave, and her son, although being the son of Abraham, was also no more than property. And he had been replaced. And there they were, literally dying in the desert. And God appeared in the form of an angel. And he spoke words of comfort and hope. And Hagar called that God El Roi, the God who hears. Nowhere else in the Bible does anyone give a name to God. God always names himself. But Hagar named God according to her experience and relationship with God, the God who hears. Now we know that God provided for Hagar and Ishmael, although we have few details about how. It certainly wouldn't have been easy. In the Middle East, in biblical times, it was all but impossible for a woman to live on her own. Did Hagar have to sell herself into slavery again? Did she get married? If so, was the man kind or terrible? Some traditions say that after Sarah died, Hagar went back to live with Abraham as his wife. Did Hagar have a long life, or did she die young? Was she ever accepted into the culture where she ended up? Was she ever seen or treated as a human being with true worth? And what about Ishmael? He married an Egyptian woman, so perhaps he was able to care for his mother, and they could live out their remaining years in her homeland. But being abandoned by one's father at the age of 14 has its effect on a child. And God predicted that Ishmael would have trouble, constantly being in conflict with others. It is slightly ironic that this passage falls on Father's Day this year. I've been thinking a lot about absent fathers, single mothers, and the brokenness that broken families leave in their wake. There are so many people who have been abandoned by their fathers or mothers, and each person is affected. Sometimes the parent was just not there physically for whatever reason. Other times the parent was there physically but never really present emotionally or mentally. Other times the parent simply rejected their child, causing them to live a lifetime of attempts to be considered worthy by someone, anyone. And sometimes a parent was just abusive. The role of a parent on a child growing up has an enormous impact. And as someone who has 2 sons, one of whose biological fathers died last summer, and the other of which has a biological father who has made tons of promises and then just disappeared, I can tell you that the fatherless or motherless child grows up with an inner sense of rejection and unworthiness and abandonment. And they often grow up with severe anger, depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. They often act out in rebellious ways. And when you ask them why they act that way, the truth is they don't know why, because the emotion inside is too strong and complex to understand. When that child grows up and starts dating, they do not know how to be a husband or a wife, and they do not know how to be a parent. And there is a huge sense of inadequacy that they bring with them into these relationships. This week I watched a show on TV with Iyanla Vanzant, who is a life coach. In one episode, she had on a family with a young woman whose behavior was out of control. And through some serious peeling away of the onion layers of the girl's life, Iyanla discovered that this girl was born to a woman in prison. Now, this girl acted out, but her actions were calls for help. She was a motherless daughter. Her family was unable to see the hurt underneath the actions, and she was unable to deal with the hurt and spent much of her life wishing simply to be dead. Only when the trauma of growing up a motherless child was dealt with by the entire family could this young woman and her family begin to heal. In another episode, a man had abandoned his 3 children in order to continue to immerse himself in the life of drugs. And he finally wanted to become a part of his sons' lives. The 3 sons, now around 30 years old, had been raised by a mother on drugs until she died. At least one of the sons then essentially lived a life on the streets among gangs and drugs and violence. Iyanla, in all of her wisdom, had all 4 of the men sit down. Each of them held a cup. Each cup was symbolically filled with their pain. The pain that had been handed down to the boys from their mom and dad, and the pain that had been handed down to the dad by his mom and dad. And on it would have gone for generations. And just as I said earlier, these 3 young men are terrified about being husbands or fathers because they never had it modeled for them. I was blessed to grow up with an awesome father. He was intelligent and kind and very loving. We did things together all the time. He taught me a million things. and there was never any question of his love for me or my family. However, my dad lived his life to a degree vicariously through my life. And because he was so hard on himself, he was also hard on me. Between about fourth grade and my junior year of college, I do not remember my dad ever telling me that he was proud of me. Now, many years later, I can tell you that my dad most definitely told me or showed me that he was proud of me during those years, but I was not able to hear it. I was not able to receive it. Because my father truly loved me and wanted me to be the best I could be, I constantly heard how I wasn't good enough or how disappointed he was in me because I didn't try hard enough. Now again, that isn't necessarily what he was saying, but it is what I heard through my own filters of rejection and low self-esteem. Now that changed when I went to seminary. But my perception of my relationship with my father had profound impact upon me for years and years until I dealt with it as an adult in counseling. This was somewhat a warped perception. So imagine what it is like for the child who is actually told by his or her parents that they are not good enough or that they are not wanted. And what greater way to tell a child that he or she is not wanted than by a parent not being present physically or emotionally? The way we view our parents directly influences the way we view God. This is especially true when it comes to fathers, because we often use the term father to talk about God. Now, the truth is, God is beyond gender. Jesus was a man, but the God we call Father has no need of gender, and females were created in God's image as much as men. One of the reasons why female attributes of God have been brought to attention in the last few decades, and why the male language has been used by people to describe God has been challenged or changed, is because people who were abused by their fathers have no way of understanding God as a loving father, because the term father for them means something completely different. The language we use greatly impacts us. Now, of course, there are those who go too far with seeing God in the feminine, but it is important to reach people where they are and to help them to understand God in a loving way. And that requires using language that they can understand. Often, people who have been rejected or abandoned by their parents feel exactly the same in their relationship with God. They think that because they were never good enough for their parents, then they are never good enough for God. They think that because their parents didn't love them, then God cannot really love them. We talk about the need as Christians to die to ourselves. And part of what that means is to let go of all of the things that we have held on to as a part of our identity, apart from God. We must learn how to put away the filters of rejection and abandonment and unworthiness. We must put away what the rest of the world or we ourselves have placed upon us. And we must claim our true identity as children of God, created in God's image, the beloved. And until we can claim that over ourselves, we can never be happy or healthy. We can never be free. We can never love or accept ourselves or others. We can never forgive others or let go of that anger and resentment and sadness that threatens at times to drown us. Iana looked at these 3 grown sons, and she said, "You are orphans, orphans with a living parent." I wonder how many people in our society feel that way. Orphans with a living parent, rejected, abandoned, unloved, unworthy, unlovable, unable to be husbands or wives or parents because it was never modeled for them. And so the brokenness is passed on from generation to generation, each generation filling the cup of brokenness of the generation to come. You know, you might be able to completely relate to the things I've been saying. Or you might be like me and have had wonderful parents. But even wonderful parents say things or do things or fail to say or do things that need to be said or done. And it leaves an indelible mark upon us. And it can hinder our ability to truly receive the grace and love of our Heavenly Father. God did something amazing with Ishmael and Hagar. There they were, left to die in the desert, abandoned by the community and family of which they had been a part. And Hagar was crying her heart out. And God heard. And God saw. And God spoke. Hagar, my precious daughter, you have been abandoned by all the men in your life, your fathers, your brothers, those in your community, and now by Abraham. But I, your heavenly Father, have never abandoned you. I will never abandon you. I see your tears. I hear your cries. And I will go with you through this desert. As I said, we really don't know much about what happened to Ishmael and Hagar other than the fact that Ishmael married an Egyptian woman. Well, Ishmael did become the father of a nation, the Ishmaelites, who later became the Arabs. The Muslims believe they are descended from Ishmael. As Isaac is a father to the Jews, Ishmael is a father to the Muslims. That means that Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all cousins who are having a family spat. We don't know. We weren't there. What we do know is that God heard, saw, and remembered God's children, Hagar and Ishmael. The world had abandoned them, but God had not and would not. Back to the show I watched this week. Iyanla, before having the three men meet their absent father, had them do something that frankly brought a tear to my eye. She had them stand up, put their arms in the air, and say, "I am my father's son." They were reluctant to do it, but she went on to explain that she was not talking about their earthly father. She was talking about their heavenly Father. The Father that sees them, hears them. The Father that remembers them. The Father that never had nor never would abandon them. The Father who had been there with them throughout every difficult moment in their lives. The men held up their hands and said, "I am my father's son." She then had them hold their hands out to each side and say, "I am my brother's keeper. I am my father's son, and I am my brother's keeper." After all, we were meant to live in community, to hold one another up, to encourage each other, and to walk with one another along this path of life. And when someone feels abandoned, rejected, or discouraged, it is up to us to remind one another that we, even in the midst of the darkest moments, are our Heavenly Father's child. Even when we can't feel Him, He's with us. Even when we can't see Him, He's with us. Even when we can't hear Him, He is with us. And even when the world, and even when we ourselves call us all kinds of terrible things, the truth is ultimately all that matters is that we love God and that we love others. For that is what it means to be a Christian. I am my father's child, and I am my brother's keeper.